Most people know that the cursed object in Oscar Wilde's 1890 novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, has supernatural properties. Fewer people know, however, that that is not the only supernatural object in the novel. In fact, Dorian Gray, it turns out, was corrupted by a book. Morally corrupted so that he would do all those horrible things that Wilde tells us about. If you take a look at this passage, it all puts it rather succinctly. The Renaissance knew of strange manners of poisoning by a helmet and a lighted torch, by an embroidered glove and a jeweled fan, by a gilded pomander and by an amber chain. Dorian Gray had been poisoned by a book. There were moments when he looked on evil simply as a mode through which he could realize his conception of the beautiful. So in that one passage, we have not only the fact that Dorian Gray was poisoned by a book, but also that his being so poisoned consisted in his finding beauty where there was evil. In other words, he read some kind of poisonous book, and it made him find beauty in evil. Interesting. This passage in chapter 14, however, is not the only or the first time that this poisonous book is mentioned. Indeed, it's described at length in chapter 10. His eye fell on the yellow book that Lord Henry had sent him. What was it, he wondered. After a few minutes, he became absorbed. It was the strangest book that he had ever read. It seemed to him that in exquisite raiment and to the delicate sound of flutes, the sins of the world were passing in dumb show before him. Things that he had dimly dreamed of were suddenly made real to him. Things of which he had never dreamed were gradually revealed. It was a novel without a plot, and with only one character, being, indeed, simply a psychological study of a certain young Parisian who spent his life trying to realize in the 19th century all the passions and modes of thought that belonged to every century except his own, and to sum up, as it were, in himself the various modes through which the world's spirit had ever passed, loving for their mere artificiality those renunciations that men have unwisely called virtue as much as those natural rebellions that wise men still call sin. The style in which it was written was that curious, jeweled style, vivid and obscure at once, full of argot and archaisms, of technical expressions and of elaborate paraphrases that characterizes the work of some of the finest artists of the French school of symbolists. There were in it metaphors as monstrous as orchids and as subtle in color. The life of the senses was described in the terms of mystical philosophy. One hardly knew at times whether one was reading the spiritual ecstasies of some medieval saint or the morbid confessions of a modern sinner. It was a poisonous book. The heavy odor of incense seemed to cling about its pages and to trouble the brain. The mere cadence of the sentences, the subtle monotony of their music, so full as it was of complex refrains and movements elaborately repeated, produced in the mind of the lad, as he passed from chapter to chapter, a form of reverie, a malady of dreaming, that made him unconscious of the falling day and creeping shadows. A captivating description indeed. Thanks, Mr. Wilde. So in the picture of Dorian Gray, we have an evil yellow book, or rather a poisonous yellow book. And when you read it, it turns out to be a novel without a plot, a plotless novel that only has one character who retreats from society and then tries to inspire in themselves all kinds of varieties of sensations. And the attempts to do that and the talk of those sensations is the substance of this poisonous book. It's wrapped in yellow, it's a poisonous book, it's a novel without a plot, and when you read it, it will corrupt you by making you find beauty in evil. Now, as you may already guess, this novel, in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray, also inspired Robert W. Chambers to write of his own poisonous, corrupting yellow book, one that resembles Wilde's own book very much. Yes, Robert W. Chambers' fictional text within a text, The King in Yellow, that cursed stage play that poisons the minds of its readers and ultimately dooms them, finds its origins here in Oscar Wilde. But it's cooler than that. For the novel that Oscar Wilde describes, this novel without a plot featuring only a young Parisian who retreats from society and then really gets down with tastes for evil stuff, is a real book. Yes, there's a real book that Wilde is alluding to, and Robert W. Chambers would have been familiar with it too. He probably read it himself. That book is Against the Grain, or Against Nature, or, as you could translate it, Backwards, by J.K. Huysmans. Very appropriate cover, I would say. This is a novel without a plot, published in 1884 to incredible acclaim and also incredible condemnation. It was a famously controversial book because it basically served as a kind of Bible for the Decadent movement. Not only does Decadent, the character in the book, the one who retreats from society, not only does he indulge in decadent tastes, but he tells you about them too. So he immediately turns into a nocturnal creature, he sleeps at the day and only comes out at night, and he makes sure that the walls of his villa are painted with colors that specifically look the best by candlelight at night. He also amasses a huge collection of gory, grisly, and gruesome paintings, including Moreau's The Apparition, The Comedy of Death, certain plates by Goya, and more. In fact, you can learn a lot about the most decadent and the most evil artwork of the time by surveying what Decadent enjoys. This is the real-life corrupting yellow book that Wilde is alluding to in The Picture of Dorian Gray, and which also inspired, both directly and indirectly, Robert W. Chambers' own supernaturally corrupting book, The King in Yellow. In that sense, I would say that A Rebours, or Against Nature by J.K. Huysmans, is as close as you're going to get to a real-life version of The King in Yellow. The stage play, I mean. This is The King in Yellow in real life. But it's not the only candidate for such a title. I'd like to tell you about a few more. Welcome to PhD&D, everyone. I'm Dr. Bowers, and this is one of my videos about The King in Yellow. Videos in which I not only review the constituent stories of Robert W. Chambers' 1895 anthology, but also in which I give you historical context, talk about the mythos implied by those stories, talk about modern works which depart from Chambers' mythos, and more. In this particular video, I want to talk about real-life versions of The King in Yellow. What do I mean? Well, I mean real-life texts which not only in some way or other fit the descriptions that Chambers gives for his accursed stage play, but which Robert W. Chambers also himself read and probably drew upon when describing that stage play in his stories. As I just demonstrated, A Rebours by J.K. Huysmans is one such text. Another one, published earlier in 1869, is the pseudonymous Chants of Maldoror by Comte de Lautremont. This work is a tirade or series of poetical tirades in which the author addresses you, the reader, in order to recount exactly how he makes himself an enemy of anything that is good, how he relishes in pure evil, hates heaven and hates God itself, and devotes all of his living efforts to sexual perversion and murder. Here I'm going to put perversion in quotes. I just mean, the things that would have been considered as such at the time to Lautremont's readers. The text challenges the readers to keep on going, dares to say that they probably have to give up now because what he's saying is far too evil. It's some real edgelord stuff, but it's also kind of the first such stuff ever written. And more importantly, it has this flowing stream of consciousness style combined with very surreal and strange imagery. Imagery about the eroticization of sharks, and shooting people and people drowning and cutting people open and hermaphroditic sex and lots of psychedelic flowing stream of consciousness stuff. That's Lautremont. And Chants Maldoror, in fact, this is the Penguin edition, was delayed in its publication precisely because the publisher feared that they would be prosecuted for blasphemy and for obscenity. That's the kind of book that this was. A relentlessly and self-consciously evil book which faced, although ultimately didn't have to endure, a banning. It's no Henri Bohr, but I would say that it too is probably a candidate for a real-life version of The King in Yellow. Chambers was probably aware of this and probably read it himself as well. Now, if you like Lautréamont, or you like the sound of Lautréamont, if you're interested in sort of flowing psychedelic literature with lots of gothic evil stuff, there's some modern fun examples of it, and I think Lautréamont is sort of a forerunner of weird literature. I would first, of course, mention Joe Cox's novella, The Wingspan of Severed Hands. This book is not only a little bit of modern King in Yellow Carcosa mythos, but it's this flowing, poetic, strange narrative that the writing is great, and it evokes Lautréamont, or at least I think it does. It's hard to read it and not think of that. I'd also recommend Michael Sisko's The Tyrant. Talk about some really amazing psychedelic gothic fantasy involving the ascendancy of something that's both evil and also beyond it. Check this one out. Also, Stephanie Klein's Planetoid Sassafras. This one is very strange, but very fun. I really like a central story in it. Not too long, and it's a good piece of Lautréamont-esque weird literature. As is The Greater Monster by David Katzman. I have to confess I haven't finished reading this one. I'm just halfway through it. Fun stuff so far. It has a lot of the kind of sexy, gothic, psychedelic, gruesome, gory, go-for-guts stuff, you know? And I would also mention Garrett Cook has a story in this tribute to David Lynch. There's also a Legati piece in here. In Heaven, Everything is Fine. There's a story, Beast with Two Backs, which, I don't know, it has a Lautréamont vibe to it, I think. Like it's a bit more structured in its presentation, but I wanted to mention it also. It's also worth mentioning Oscar Wilde's 1893 play, Salome. It's a grisly, lascivious embellishment of Salome's famous request for the head of John the Baptist. And it's a self-consciously evil play. I would say it's a real piece of decadent writing, with bits of its text that Chambers has quoted in other works. It was a stage play that was publicly banned, forbidden, and also sold while it was being banned in yellow paper. Thus it was labeled with yellow not only for its associations with the decadent movement who had adopted the color, but also for obscenity. Since it's a banned stage play written by a decadent and wrapped in yellow paper, and since Robert W. Chambers was familiar with it and inspired by it and knew of it before he wrote his own 1895 stories, it too could qualify as a real-life version of The King in Yellow. That's Oscar Wilde's Salome from 1893. Now, a lot of people know that Wilde's Salome was influential on Robert W. Chambers' descriptions of The King in Yellow, but not as many people realize or know the influence of another play by a different decadent playwright. I'm speaking of a play called Madame la Mort, or Madame Death, by the playwright Raschild. This is another pseudonym. Raschild's play was not only published to be written, but also performed in 1891, and it was pretty popular, to the point where I bet Robert W. Chambers was exposed to it, especially given what would otherwise be huge coincidences. For instance, we know that in The Repairer of Reputations and also in The Yellow Sign, that the stage play, The King in Yellow, really exerts its force at the beginning of the second act. That the first act of the stage play is rather mundane and unassuming, and that allows the reader or the viewer to have their guard let down, right? It seems boring and mundane, so their guard gets let down. And then the second act comes and really wallops the audience or the reader with some horrible truths that forever change how they view the world and may even shape their fates, right? So we have a play where I don't think it has just two acts, but I also think Robert W. Chambers is deliberately vague on that matter. We know that it has at least two acts, and that the second one is the really eldritch, horrible one that seems to doom people who read it. So, a short play with a kind of boring first act and then a second act that hits hard. We also know that the play largely concerns an alien world called Carcosa with all kinds of strange metaphysical deviations from reality. A short stage play that concerns some other world, but which starts out boring, in other words. Well, guess what Madame la Mort is? It's a short stage play, only 3 acts, and the second act is absolutely bizarre, morbid, and does not take place in physical reality. It might take place in the doomed mind of one of its characters, it might take place in the afterlife, or it might, as I think, take place in the space between life and the afterlife. It's sort of in this liminal border space that isn't our physical world, but it's also not the oblivion of the hereafter either. And it's in this weird other place that we also meet the creature Madame la Mort, or Lady Death. And she is this spectral thing that seems to be intimately connected with this supernatural place. It's almost like she's a symbol rather than a character, although she does exhibit a whole lot of really interesting arguments. She presents interesting arguments for why death is superior to life. She's also dressed in tattered, pale clothing and is sort of gray and pale, right? So Madame la Mort has this other reality, this other world, kind of like how Carcosa is another world. And it has this weird, obscure, spectral figure presiding over it, Madame la Mort, kind of like the King in Yellow. And it's a stage play where the second act is the one that hits really hard, that really goes off the rails, just like in The King in Yellow. I would wager that Madame la Mort was considerably influential when Chambers was trying to think about, well, what sort of a stage play would it be? How should I allude to parts of it? I would put its influence right up there with Oscar Wilde's picture of Dorian Gray, Salome, and Huysmans' A Rebours. And finally, and perhaps most fundamentally, I would add Edgar Allan Poe's 1843 poem, The Conqueror Worm. I've discussed this poem and its influence on The King in Yellow in another video. But in this symbolic poem by Edgar Allan Poe, we are told of a gala night where an angel throng witnesses some kind of play, some sort of theater stage play thing. The orchestral pit is the movement of the planets, the music of the spheres, and we are given a very bleak and nihilistic picture of humanity. Human beings are represented as these mimes that mutter and run directionlessly all over the stage, pursuing things that turn out to be phantoms of their own creation. And it also turns out that they're not even in control of their own movements, but instead at the movements of vast formless things, like the laws of nature and biological imperatives and urges. And finally, at the end, you have the actual hero of the play, which is a giant bloody worm monster that comes and eats all of the things that represent human beings, and that's the end. And once the curtain falls, the angels kind of look at each other with a depressed look, and they're like, yep, that's humanity. That's more or less a paraphrase of Poe's poem, right? A cosmic stage play about the truth of the world and humanity's place in it, a cosmic truth, a truth from the perspective of angels, and it's a perspective that shows that there's nothing significant about human beings. We're just worm food. Right? A very nihilistic perspective that the French decadents would really roll with and fall in love with, as they were also falling in love with other, evil things and death and corpses and vampires and Satanism and all this other stuff. But I'm going to talk about that in a different video. For now, I wanted to do a fun video about a little bit of history, some real-life versions of The King in Yellow. That is to say, texts that exist in real life, which inspired Robert W. Chambers to describe his stage play the way that he described it, and which, in their own features in various ways, resemble that stage play. Real-life versions of The King in Yellow. Does that excite you? Are you going to read any of them? If so, let me know in the comments. Stay tuned for more King in Yellow videos and other videos about stuff, and be careful about finding the yellow sign. Have you found the yellow sign?